All right. We are at time. We are still having folks come in, so I'm going to go ahead and just start doing some of my background introduction-y type things as people join. So please join, state where you're from, take a look at the amazingness that's going on in the background of your videos. We have all clearly hit that point in our working remote where this is a needed hour to come together, and I'm happy to be a part of it today. So we are talking about outcomes, alignment, and mapping. Oh my. Curriculum mapping and how can we think about that as it relates to future planning in our work. I'm going to be joined, I'm Natasha Jankowski, my apologies. I'm the Executive Director for the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, and I am joined today by Dan McInerney, who's joining from Utah, and Errin Heyman, who works with the California Institute for Advanced Management. And they'll be talking, Erin's really going to bring a student perspective to these conversations and to bear on that, and Dan is bringing some faculty ideas, and then will lead us into discussion. Last week, I felt we ran a bit long. We didn't really get to have our discussion time, so we have tried to streamline and shorten this week to make sure that we can get into it. And for those that are new, welcome. That's Errin and Dan, in case you see their pictures, to our NILOA webinar series. We did sort of 2 starting community check-ins, and then we moved into talking about what can we start doing to plan for this future, and what are some things that we have that we can modify to move forward. So our time together today will be, I'll do a super quick recap, talk about mapping, and what we can think about in relation to that, pass it to Errin, who's going to talk about students, and then we'll circle back to Dan, who's going to then lead us into deep, thought-provoking, philosophical questions that will probably culminate in an existential crisis, but we will be there together and we will figure it out and come back around. If you're just joining, yes, this is recorded. The slides will be shared. We do have a continuation of the conversation on Twitter. If you do that, we're using hashtag NILOA webinar. And we also do have a Google Doc of updated resources that are things that are relevant and timely as we hear and come across them. We curate it and keep it on the website. And all of our prior webinars and things are found there. So that gets you caught up. So just as some kind of quick ground rules of things to remember from our prior conversations is to be careful that this is not our test of online education. This is really about learning during a global pandemic crisis with this super quick shift to remote instruction. That compassion, not trying to align with shifting compliance and guidance, should be driving our decisions at this time. That we need to listen to our students and try to be as flexible as possible. Surveying them is awesome, but let's please not over-survey them and do it in partnership with folks that have different ideas and ways to stay connected. And let's also not start at a place where we're requiring higher level of proof of learning in an online class than we would in a face-to-face, especially in our current situations. One thing to add to that prior conversation we had on community check-ins, if you haven't seen it, is ACE released a statement today. Today's the 16th, right? Am I traveling through time? Yes, today, that I wanted to share with you guys on principles that they are recommending that's been signed by several other organizations about acceptance of pass-fail credit, which was a part of a conversation that's happening. So if you want anything related to that, it's a cool statement. Go check it out. We kept talking then in our second community check-in about, let's not start from a place that students are cheaters and we got to stop them from that, of sort of thinking negatively about our learners, but instead thinking about how can we really enable and support learning for our students at this time. Also conversations on how do we modify and what do we do with end of course faculty evaluations, and they're really thinking about using them more as a formative planning tool, not as something for promotion and tenure. And then what do we do with the assessment of student learning? That is ongoing this semester. We have assignments, we have tasks, we have ways that we're looking at that learning, but how important are those annual reports? Can that be postponed? Where does that fall? And conversations on that front. Last week, we had a conversation on assignment design. And if you were on the NILOA newsletter, you got this out emailed today. We released a modified sort of toolkit guidance on how to do virtual assignment design conversations with modified questions in light of coronavirus situations. So you've got that tool. And we have 2 more webinars left, one on evidence-based storytelling. So how are we going to talk about this stuff that we've done and the decisions we've made and thinking about that. And then also transparency, which is going to be increasingly important in our work. So that gets you all caught up. You have now no need to go back and watch any of these prior webinars. I'm kidding, go check them out, they're great. So what are we talking about today? Well, Today we're really thinking about mapping, because last week we focused on revising assignments and thinking about our assessments, but how do those assignments fit into a larger trajectory of learning? How can we start planning not just how to modify our assignments for the terms that are coming up, but to think about where do we have learning that we need to maybe circle back around on, to do a refresher, to really think about that, to keep our students moving towards the learning outcomes that we care about in the most. So it's really thinking about this from a program future planning place related to the learning we want to see. We focused here on the maps to really, as a mechanism to help us think about our intentional design. So I'm starting from a place, if we think about maps as a visual about our design, that we have in our curriculum some kind of intentional design behind the learning that we ask, the experiences that we're going for, and what a course is doing as a part of something larger to move our students to the learning that we want to see. That only works, though, if that is true. So if there's just sort of haphazard, or we're like, I don't know, we offer some courses, learning happens, it's a mystery, then this becomes harder to do. But if we've done sort of thinking about mapping, where we want this learning to unfold, how that fits into the curriculum, and we have layers that we can look at our maps, then we're in a really interesting place to take conversations around mapping and have future planning conversations on design. I am not going to go into the basics of doing mapping. We have a toolkit. There's information that you can find on that on our website. Please feel free to go and check that out. So this is more thinking about what do we want to do today to modify things to think about how to apply it in the future. So I want to start from a foundational kind of assumption that we can operate with in thinking about mapping and planning, that the learning that we really want to see, those learning outcomes that we care about the most, cannot happen in a single course or in a single semester. They necessarily occur over time. Our students have to run into them in multiple occasions in different ways to try their learning. So if we start from there as an assumption that we're on this learning journey, that writing takes multiple times and iterations to engage with it, then we're going to now use some awesome graphic designs. I'm not a graphic designer. I apologize for these arrows. So in our learning trajectory, we still had a whole time in the fall semester that students got through and they learned. And we had a huge chunk of our spring semester in which learning was unfolding, things were going as they were. Our problem now is we're in this sort of, it feels like huge place of lightning strike, and which is somehow, how do we come back from this? How do we plan learning? Where are we going in this space? With the idea that, you know, there is still a trajectory that continues on after this. So if we go back to thinking about our maps and we go back to thinking about modifying that to our current situations, we have some ideas that I think might be useful to think about. So we can make the case for mapping in a slightly different way. Instead of saying, let's map the curriculum and figure this out, we can really use this as an opportunity to take a look at our maps and examine where faculty may need to spend time on a specific learning outcome or do a refresher in an upcoming course from something that was going to be slated for later in the semester that got a bit canceled in the way that it had been originally planned. We can also think about this as program planning, not curriculum mapping. So to go and have a conversation like, let's do curriculum mapping, probably not exciting for people right now. But to say we really need to think about program planning, and we can look at our curriculum maps to help us with this, to get back to the basics on learning outcomes and assessments. And if we've gone down to things like assignments, this is a great time to have that conversation on, well, when are we assessing them? Where did they get assessed? In what assignments? In what way? And how can we think about modifying those assignments to ensure that we're still getting towards that learning? So we can carry from our assignment conversation last week to think about, well, where is that going to fall as they move into this week? If you want to engage in this, we are brainstorming some questions that we can ask and think about in relation to maps and future planning. And some of that is, what from this term that we're currently in are students going to need to apply in either the summer or the fall, and how are we setting them up for learning success and rethinking those courses and assignments? Do we need to do a bit of redesign on a course if we were expecting a student to be here, and we maybe need to knock it down a bit in terms of, let's take the first 2 weeks to really make sure that that learning unfolded in meaningful ways, and how do we want to think about moving? So you can sort of say, where do we need to refinagle and spend a little focus? It's also a great opportunity to go back to basics, asking, well, what are the learning outcomes that our students need from this course? And what are they going to apply elsewhere? Is this something that was unique to this course? Is this something that builds over time? And really have some of those, why does this course even exist, for the things that we want to do in our program conversations. It's also a great opportunity to remind ourselves that there is learning that occurred. There's learning that occurred even in this semester that we can build upon. And so what do we know we got to that we can sort of start from there as a place of building and think about in relation to our course design and future planning. And some are even saying, in the instance of labs, how can we consider this the application of a flipped semester or a flipped summer, where students are actually learning about a concept, watching lectures, doing these things, and then we'll apply and practice when they return. So it's more content knowledge, thinking about that, to then think about when an assessment and an application applies elsewhere. So just different ways to think about it. And then how can we also think about learning from a program perspective? Where does what we're happening now fit into an overall curriculum? Now, we can do this with our faculty. They can do this virtually. A couple of caveats to have on that is, to get people, there's a lot going on, time commitments. We talked about this last week with assignments. The same still holds. Yes, you can do this where everyone gets together, they're in breakout rooms, they're talking at the same time, but that may be very unrealistic for people's lived experiences at this time. So you can do things like discuss and share in a Google Doc or an Excel sheet. This is not as easy as just putting X's to things. You're going to need to have some comment boxes and bubbles and get some responses going back and forth. But you can use, I can get into it at my own time, as I've got attention span and leisure in that way. And then we can also think about using surveys of our faculty and students to think, or even modifying course evaluations to be asking questions about which learning outcomes people think they got, or faculty, like, what learning outcomes do you really think were captured and addressed in this semester, or ones that maybe are a bit more wishy-washy, for a technical term, to engage in there. All right, so last note that I want to say, and this is just something that I've been hearing that fundamentally bothers me as a person, so I'm just sharing this because I can, before I turn this over to Errin to talk about students, is thinking about graduating seniors and degree quality. So one of the questions that we have been getting asked is, what does this do to degree quality? We have students that are graduating this semester, and they have, lost, let's say, the latter half of this semester. Is their degree in jeopardy? I'm just going to put out there that I think it is incredibly unlikely that if there was a crucial element of learning, that we would hold that as educators to the last 6 weeks of their last semester in a program. So this is that larger, remind people we have been building to things over time as a degree. If you had some experiential learning, you've got clinicals, you're out doing stuff, that can be a different conversation. That's the application of knowledge you've been working on along the way. But does this compromise the integrity of an entire degree? No, it does not, because this is a learning trajectory space. So if you haven't gotten it by now as a graduating student, you were not going to get it in the last 6 weeks. And if our degrees are mapped and aligned, then something like this semester break and situation doesn't make or break that holistic quality of the degree. And I think that's an important point to sort of remember and come back to in these conversations. So that gets you caught up, gives you a little bit of framing. I am now going to turn this over to my good colleague, Errin, who's going to talk about student pathways.
Great. Thanks, Natasha. Hi, everybody. I'm excited to see some familiar faces and familiar names, and glad that everybody can get together as a community. I mean, I think that, like Natasha said, that's an important piece of what we do and how we get through this crazy time. And I'm going to just lead through just a few ideas about how we can use curriculum mapping. Natasha has the great and important area of clicker, so I will just say next when I'm ready. And so as we think about student pathways, really looking at curriculum mapping as a student tool, students should be aware of our assessment tools. They should certainly know the benefits of what we're doing with assessment. Curriculum maps have the ability to connect outcomes and learning, of course, and with courses and assignments. So when students ask things like, why am I taking this course? or why am I doing this assignment, things like curriculum maps can help. And though, you know, curriculum map may not be the best way to term it to a student, it might not be as palatable, but you can say things like pathways, or in this case too, to be able to really look at, you know, maybe even student affairs using something like this. So they could use curriculum maps as perhaps saying a roadmap to graduation, a way of thinking of how can our own assessment tools and our assessment planning or program planning be useful to not only just academics, but to student affairs and the students themselves. Next. So then we also want to be able to, as I said, allow students to look at this as a pathway to their learning, the connection of linking outcomes to courses, assignments to course content. Next. So through a curriculum map, or CM, students can see the pathways and the connections among, yes, classes, outcomes, assignments, their full degrees. And so really thinking of, you know, a collection of courses a program does not make. So there should be some intentional alignment. There should be some leadway into one outcome to the next. I mean, all of these things that we talked about and that Natasha refreshed our memory on as well. And next, please. So we look at this as perhaps a time of expectations and maybe a time of missed expectations. Right now, as many schools pivot quickly to online, we have a great opportunity, though many may not see that right now, to really tap into our students and to discuss some of what students are asking for and thinking about. We're seeing more and more now, or I'm reading more about how some students are asking for refunds now, that those expectations in learning have not been met. Next. So I think we really want to use this time to explore student input and meeting expectations, and maybe where there are some misalignment of expectations. And next. And that's, of course, as you know, Natasha reminded us, we're seeing an awful lot of rhetoric about this as well, that now is not the time to really assess the effectiveness or efficacy of online learning, because really what we're doing is remote teaching in many ways, especially as we're pivoting quickly to move what would originally be face-to-face to a distance format. So keeping in mind the intentionality of online learning, designing an online class, especially if it's fully online, that takes a lot of design, of again, intentionality and how these things are going to work online. Simply moving to a distance format, while it allows us to continue, which is very important, is not really how we want to look at designing online courses. So I think to think of this time as, you know, let's see what students think about online learning who maybe haven't been online learning, or faculty as well. This is not the time to do that. Next. It is time, however, to really think about considering gathering input. What are student expectations of learning in connection to assignments? And next, I think we're good. Oh, I'm a little behind there. What did students expect to learn, and certainly what do faculty intend for the students to learn, which is not different now than it is when we're thinking about curriculum mapping or pathways to learning as it has been in the past. We want to ensure that those connections are there, where we're succeeding, what we are missing. And now more than ever, although I would encourage you to think about this in, you know, regular times or normalcy times, of how students are meeting those expectations. How are we meeting those expectations through outcomes and learning assignments? And next. So students in program planning, as we think really looking at this opportunity to think forward, plan forward, next, we want to think about, you know, pivoting to rethink outcomes and assignments. Are there moments, and this happens, you know, the learning happened previously in the semester, in different classes, in different terms, and that learning will continue, as Natasha said, moving forward. But this is an opportunity to ask our students, next, do some outcomes need more reinforcement? Or will they? You know, this might be a time to really rethink the curriculum map or the learning design, program planning, which we should be doing anyway, periodically, and not periodically as in waiting 5 to 7 years for full program review, but we should be thinking about this, you know, on a regular basis anyway. How are students learning? How are our assignments matching with outcomes? What do students think? Next. So what would your students recommend? Next. We could talk about surveys, although there's a lot of talk about surveys, a lot of talk about course evaluations and getting student input. We want to be sure not to over survey our students, but we are interested, of course, in what this time is doing for our students or not allowing our students to do in terms of learning. There's opportunities, I think, with discussions, whether they're fully online or during Zoom. How are students being able to articulate what they're learning? And are they matching with our outcomes and curriculum design? You could think too about final writing prompts or final assignments. You know, how did this assignment connect to XYZ outcomes? Ask the students to give that information back to you. Think about how then you might be able to inform next planning periods, next courses, next assignments. And so I'd really love to invite you to think about this exceptional time as just that, an exceptional moment in time to really engage our students in the educational curriculum or their pathway to learning, and think about ways that we can engage them during what might be not normalcy for them. And certainly there's anxiety and certainly there's stress beyond just having to move to a distance format. But think of this time to really gather students' input and help them to more and more connect those assignments with the learning pathways. I think that's it for me.
Awesome. Thank you, Errin, so much for bringing that student's important voice to bear and thinking about how our students are active participants in their learning and a wonderful wealth of expert knowledge about their experiences. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to turn this over to Dan, who's going to talk about curriculum mapping and faculty.
Yeah, talking about this, first of all, thanks to Natasha for putting this webinar together, and for all 300 of you for participating in this webinar today. I wanted to think about some of these questions from the perspective of a faculty member, and I'm in the deep of it, just like many of you right now. I'm teaching 2 gen ed courses, one that's been online the whole semester and one that became online in early March. And I want to pick up on a topic that Errin left off with, and it's one about how we even talk about this period that we find ourselves in. I'm thinking of an analogy to many of us who have been working on assessment issues that are tied to equity-focused projects. How many of us involved in these kinds of activities have been asked to rethink some of the categories the categories of analysis that we bring to our projects? For example, rather than looking at students and thinking primarily about their deficits in a course, starting our thinking by examining the assets that students bring into a course. And I want to suggest that perhaps it's a good time to think about our own moment in that way next. And that's approaching all this work about mapping, along with our work about teaching, getting through a course, but not framing all of this as some kind of disruption, not framing it as a crisis or as an emergency. Next. And I suggest that for 2 reasons. Number one, this may be our new normal for a while. The work we're doing now might very well continue in the fall. But more importantly, I think we should try to recognize the productive nature of the work we're all doing this academic term. Because in this reorganization of higher learning, who isn't focused on core goals? As we tell a faculty member, take what you have in the remainder of this academic term and transfer it into an online system of learning. Who doesn't come back to this basic question? Okay, what am I trying to achieve in this course? And hopefully maybe people are also thinking, gee, how does this also relate to my colleagues, to their work, and to our curriculum as a whole? Next. But also, very importantly, what has all of this taught us as faculty members about non-standard learning? And I've got that phrase in quotes because next. It comes from some thoughts by the former president of the Association of American Colleges and Universities, Carol Geary Schneider. Writing in 2013 about the degree qualifications profile, Carol said the following. Next. She is other members of the writing team of the degree qualifications profile were quite critical about assessment that was based on standardized learning, that it's antithetical to adaptive and inventive competencies, that non-standard problems, which standardized tests don't do a good job of measuring, those are the ultimate test of a student's competence at work, at life, and in the community. When we prepare students to tackle what's non-standard, unscripted, where right answers aren't known, the nature of the problem is uncertain, we're doing the best possible work we can in higher education. Because college, Carol continued, Carol has to prepare learners to deal with the complex and uncertain, not just with the rote and routine. Why am I showing you this? Every place you see the word student in that quote, substitute the word faculty. And what are we learning about what we do day in and day out? What we do in our individual courses, what we do in our curriculum, what we do with our colleagues in the learning that we've outlined for our students. Rather than thinking of this part of the academic term as a crisis or as a moment of difficulty, think of it as a very interesting exercise in our own non-standard learning and what this is helping us bring to questions about our students, about equity, about curriculum mapping. Next. And it's a good time to ask what I think, judging from what my colleagues are telling me, what we all know we're all trying to learn about our core goals and curriculum. And that what may be difficult, trying to capture this at a tough moment. For some of us, like in my courses, we're looking now at the last days of the semester. Exams are coming up, a no test week is coming up, lots of communication with students, especially as we all know, students who are undergoing a lot of stress and anxiety, very understandable at this point. What are some of the best ways we can capture the thoughts that we know faculty members have on their minds about the core goals of our program and the way a curriculum should be designed? You're the best judge of this because this is going to vary campus to campus, from faculty who tend to be kind of skeptical and standoffish about these kinds of questions to faculty who you may understand are much more inclined to be comfortable talking about this. How do we capture this in ways that are not adding more stress to the work that faculty are doing with students? Natasha, Errin have already talked about end of year meetings of a department. And perhaps if there are department heads in the audience, you might think that this is a good time to raise questions about core goals and curriculum in an end of year interview as you review the work of a faculty member over the semester. And Natasha has added one other suggestion here about a virtual happy hour. That is not my language because I don't think I'm allowed to even write that in Utah. But
I know, I'm sorry. But you could do it from anywhere if it's virtual.
Yeah, I mean, I could say that's a gin and tonic. Next. Next. Oh, here we go. Yeah, and I was just trying to think of questions that, and look, I'm just putting this in personal terms. What are the questions that I'd be willing to ask some of my faculty colleagues? Again, some of whom are always deeply engaged in these kind of questions, and some of whom just stand away from these kinds of issues. What's the best way to be kind of diplomatic and inviting in the way we raise this question? For example, has this shift that we've all undergone, what's it led you to think about our core learning outcomes? If colleagues aren't comfortable with that language, just to say, what does this make you think about the goals of our program? And to reiterate something that was said earlier, ask people about the assignments that they've been led to continue or substitute, and how effective those have been. Next. It might be a time too to kind of gently raise the suggestion that we might be back in this situation in August and September. And if we are online again, what might we be doing to make sure that we're continuing our students' learning in our different fields in the best possible ways? One other thought came to mind. So many of us are involved not just with equity-focused reform projects, but also projects that are trying to tie together the learning at an institution of higher learning and future careers. If we're aligning our learning outcomes with career skills, we have an obligation to step back and try to consider how businesses, nonprofits, how many different firms are themselves thinking of these issues right now to better inform our students. Next. So I wanted to close with some questions that I hope you'll participate in. And Natasha and Errin and I have purposely tried to keep our comments as limited as possible in this webinar, because we know the richness of the suggestions that come from the people who are participating in this. I'm very curious, for example, but there are many other questions to ask here. I'm just very curious about what you've seen among your own faculty colleagues. Is this a tough time to engage in a conversation about curriculum mapping? What about the suggestions that Natasha raised at the beginning of this webinar? Another way of presenting the question. Can you think of other effective ways to capture the very rich self-reflections that faculty are going through right now as they work on restructuring their classes, and how we can best learn from the changes we've had to make this term? I'm raising these things as questions. Some observations I've seen as somebody in the thick of it right now, and a curiosity, a deep curiosity about what you're seeing on your campuses with your colleagues and in your classes too. Thanks for the opportunity just to review these ideas with you.
Thank you so much, Dan and Errin. I am going to get us out of this share so we can open this up and have discussion time. So yes, I'm going to get into the chat and see what's going on there, but please feel free to unmute yourself. We really welcome any sort of thoughts that you have or questions that you have or where you are and thinking about how to start future planning. Well, we said, yes, let's think about assignments to reassess, but that longer term trajectory of how do these things fit? Do we need to rethink our learning outcomes, and how does that all sort of fit together for what our new normal might be in this space? So we'll go ahead and open it up, and feel free to ask Dan, Errin, or myself, or anyone else that you see hanging out in Zoom.
Hi there, I can share a thought. My name is Bridget McGuire, and I'm a Associate Dean of Assessment in Rapid City, South Dakota. And we work with, my school works with a pretty challenging population. You know, these equity issues are kind of front and center for us. One thing that's occurred to me as I've been seeing lots of calls go out from many institutions to their faculty for compassion and flexibility, because students are dealing with something really difficult and unprecedented, as we all are, is that when I'm confronted with those issues in just a normal time, having a clear understanding of course objectives and how those relate to the larger goals of a program and the larger goals of a discipline, those help me to be flexible for my students. because I can say, well, maybe you can't do the assignment in this way because of something that's happening in your life. But if I can come up with a way for you to complete the assignment that still fulfills those core goals, then we can work to get through your situation together. And so I suspect that one thing that may happen as a result of this is that faculty begin to see the value of having those core goals and objectives in any circumstance, because it allows them to be flexible for students and flex for students in a way that still allows us to say we've met our core objectives.
No, I love that, Bridget. Thank you so much for sharing. It also makes me think about the importance of involving our advisors in these kinds of conversations, or thinking about how to partner in meaningful ways with advising to help understand and move through, so that students can experience some of these things that we really intend and want. And if there are things that are happening with life and other structures and that, but there is learning that we're like, this is really the course to do, having folks that also know how to help prioritize for our learners to get to that, I think would be really, really insightful and helpful. Wonderful. Other thoughts?
I would like to, I don't want this to sound like a commercial for this particular company, but a lot of times when I look at curriculum maps, they look kind of like a matrix, and you've got your learning objectives over here on one side, and you've got your courses across the top, and you put an I or a A or a D for introduce, develop, or assess in there, but it looks just kind of like a matrix. And it's difficult just looking at the matrix to delve into the individual courses and really see how they develop the learning outcomes. There's a company that's fairly new. We've been encouraging our folks to work with this company. It's called CourseTune. And the courses look like wheels, and the outcomes are spokes on the wheel. The assessments are layered around the wheels, and you've got your whole program that you can see right there on the screen, and you can click on it and you can see, you can click on the outcome and you can see which courses deal with that outcome. And you can dig down even to the assignments and the assessments associated with it. And it's a wonderful tool. And if you Google CourseTune, all one word, you'll find it. But it's awesome and much richer than just a matrix.
No, that's great, Patty. There's also another, it's a really nice example. I think ALHE did a webinar on different ways that people were going about doing more interactive mapping, and they have one that it plays notes. It goes across like for music, so you can hear if it's in tune or out of tune kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of different ways to visualize. This also, though, brings up to me a point that I don't think, I'm not sure if I was clear on prior, but in our current time, the mapping conversation is less about the documentation, if you don't have the documentation of it, and more about fostering planning types of discussions that revolve around learning. And so if we aren't in a place, I would say, I would caution against being like, let's get together and map all our stuff, and here's another technology to learn for folks at this time. There are a ton of great resources out there. Definitely take the time to look. But really it's more, there are some key questions that we can ask ourselves that are driven by learning and assessments and assignments to help us plan and be mindful and focused for both our faculty and our students. And we might not document that. It might just be, here's some questions to ask and some dialogues to have. And here's some ways to involve your students in that feedback process. And then maybe later kind of worry about how do we capture some of those decisions and revisions that have been going on. But yes, there's some really cool, CourseTune is great and pretty easy to use. And there's a ton of really interesting providers that are coming out with really cool ways to do mapping. But awesome. Yeah. And I love all this. So good.
So this is Joanne Benage. You know, we have been evaluating, and one of my team members is on this webinar. Well, both of my team members are on it. And, you know, tools are great. We will not have budget for new tools. We will be holding on to keep the tools we have and the people we have in this very tough time we're going to be moving into. So I really appreciate what you just shared. You know, kudos to everybody that has those now, maximize them. But we're really looking at how can we take some of the benefits of enterprise systems and build them into what we have, and maybe even pivot, there I used it, to something that we have on our campus that we aren't currently using. So again, I applaud everybody who has those tools. We will not be in a position to purchase anything in the very near future. So I like the emphasis on planning and intentionality of the process, regardless of how you end up recording it.
This is also a great opportunity to do a reminder and a shout out for students can be a wonderful tool and helper and solver in a problem around this. They have ways that they can map and visualize, and it might be that this is a project that someone has to help figure out what this might look like. But it's a great opportunity to say this is a collective issue, and how can we pull our knowledge, capacity, resources together to solve this when we're all scattered and spread thin. So yes, all of this sounds great. I will be quiet and stop replying to everyone that speaks and let you guys discuss. I'm sorry.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Yarek Yanyo. I'm the Santa Ana College Student Learning Outcomes Coordinator. And I think my question would be to Dan, who spoke a little bit about equity. Can you hear me okay? Okay, I sometimes mute myself and I just, thank you. These days, you know, Zoom is a commonplace, so we watch webinars and people talking about equity issues. And it seems like the push out there is really for completion of courses, better degrees, transfer rates, all those achievement-oriented data. And I think that what I see is missing is this equity part in terms of what it is that students learn. And since Dan mentioned it, perhaps if you don't mind just speaking a little bit more to this, my concern is again that we are following practices such as, or at least we are asked to follow practices such as, oh yeah, make assignments less demanding, or give students more time, be more lenient when it comes to meeting deadlines, you know, things of that nature. But I really haven't heard much, if anything at all, about what it is that students learn, especially in this environment. So I would just appreciate some thoughts on that.
One of the courses I'm involved in is a pilot project that's competency-based, and it's dealing with adult learners, people who have full-time jobs and families, and who don't fit into the usual category of 18 to 21-year-old undergraduates. And working with them has taught me something quite important about an online course that has an equity focus. And it's taught me especially something about assignments. I designed that course in part because of the demands of our university to see this completely formed course back in December, before it was even open to students. I've learned the value of being very flexible, not with the ease or difficulty of assignments, not with the demands I'm making on students, but with the flexibility of the schedule itself. Having a core set of objectives, but understanding that I can move towards those objectives in multiple ways. I'll just give one short example of this. Part of the final grade for this competency-based U.S. history intro course involves online discussions. I was asking at the beginning of the semester students to engage in discussions about very carefully articulated and very specific historical episodes and debates. And by early March, I was shifting the focus. And I made our current situation the historical moment for them to discuss in historical context. Other presidents, other administrations, other periods in American history have faced times of emergency and crisis. And the Constitution has shifted over time in adapting to these emergencies. Talk about our present moment and what you've seen, what you've heard, what you've experienced in this historical context. What have we learned from these past moments that illuminates what we're going through today? Now, this is in one discipline, history, and we have a lot of flexibility within that discipline itself. But I'm certain that my colleagues, with their expertise in a range of disciplines, have the same kind of capacity to think about a particular learning goal. In this case, for me, these discussions were episodes in civil debate among students. And there are many ways of achieving that goal. I think keeping in mind that kind of flexibility, shifting things around, what I found out was that it certainly fit the moment, but more importantly, didn't upset students at all. In fact, I think they were very grateful for the adaptation to current needs. Those are just some immediate thoughts that come to mind about this issue.
If I could add another thought, there's been a lot of talk about the importance of taking into account the different access to technology students are going to have and different demands on their time and caretaking responsibilities. But I think another area where we are broadening inequities is as faculty are scrambling to switch assessments and assignments online, it's easy, it's very difficult to include the best level of explanation possible. And in any instance, when an assignment isn't fully explained, we're exaggerating the effects of privilege, because students who've done similar assignments or who have somebody that is sheltering with them that can tell them what the faculty member means, or who feel comfortable enough to email the faculty member to ask for clarification, all of those students are going to end up having better access to demonstrate their learning than a student who either doesn't feel comfortable seeking more information or doesn't have sources of information. And so, you know, that's, for example, one piece that I think is a broad access related component that we need to encourage faculty to think about.
Yeah, plus one to that for sure, Karen. And I think one other way to consider this is, so I'm teaching a class this semester. And one of the things that I did with my students is we went back and for their culminating assignments, we pulled the syllabus up. We said, here are the learning outcomes. We have done these three. Like, we're good, we're set on doing these things. Do you guys feel like you are too? The main point of this assignment is this last one here, to really flex a skill that we're going to have to keep applying, which is around how do you make academic arguments in relation to like journal articles, this graduate class. And so I said, and it's a history class as well, Dan, so I was thinking about you, but part of it had been originally archival analysis, which was just an interesting way to have people explore an archive, not at all related to an actual learning outcome that was there. So that's gone anyway. And that's fine. And we'd gone to like visit an archive prior, so that's also fine. But you have no access to that. But what I did to the students is I said, what can you feasibly do? The evaluative criteria stays the same. What I'm trying to get to is the same for the learning outcome. But how do you feel that you can demonstrate to me your attainment of this learning outcome at this time? What does that look like for you? For some, it was a critical book review. For some, it was a critical review of an article. For some, it was argument mapping, some different prior works that they'd done, because they were like, I can't do something now, but I can go back and look at something I've done before. And so as a crew, we decided, okay, this is what makes sense for people. so I'm being equitable in allowing that flexibility for what is possible and doable for my students, but also making really clear, what are we going for? Why does this exist here? How does this relate? Where are we going to use it? How can you think about what muscles we're flexing in that educational journey through this? But in terms of lowering quality, no, the outcome is the same. There are many roads to get there. It's sort of like Rome. We're going to get to Rome. There's many roads that lead to Rome. You can take a lot of different roads to Rome, but we'll still end up at Rome. Some may faster than others, but that's totally fine.
Yeah, I just wanted to second what Dan was saying too about the achievement piece and the outcomes piece. I think it's really important now or anytime to really think about, what are the outcomes we're looking to achieve, and not to lessen rigor on that, but to be flexible and understanding with access of just the technology, as Karen was mentioning. And, we still live in a country where, especially, young children, we assume everybody has online access. So then this is not the case. And so, that's a whole other conversation, but it's something to consider. And so that flexibility has to be there, I think, right now. But the outcomes and the achievement of those outcomes, even if we shift to a different way to meet those, still has to be there. It has to be important. And whether we have to reinforce those again next term or a term or two down the line because of all of this, we may need to do that. But I don't think we should sacrifice rigor ever, but we should be compassionate and we should help our students meet those.
Yeah, these are not mutually exclusive categories. Yeah.
I would suggest one other thing. The past 6 weeks, 8 weeks, they've been an extraordinary episode in equity-based reforms of higher education. I think we typically consider equity-focused projects in terms of a given at the beginning of a semester, the condition, the circumstance, the background of a student that has been set over time as a semester begins. This moment reminds us of something else, the fragility of those circumstances, how quickly they can break apart and change dramatically, and how we have to be attentive to questions about equity in ways that we might not have anticipated in 2019. I think this is something else more generally to think about in relation to this other question about equity-focused projects. Just think of the letters and the discussions that have been coming from your students, the heartbreaking stories that we've all heard about, and the circumstances that students never anticipated in their lives that have affected them like that. Anyone who's addressing equity-focused issues has to think about this moment as an extraordinary learning opportunity.
All right, I think we have time for one more question to keep us on track. Or if you've got, some uplifting, happy news you want to share, we will take that too. So, user choice.
Somebody say happy news?
Yes.
So a former student of mine, when I was advising with SNHU, who, when I left SNHU, I have since come back, but when I left SNHU, he was about halfway through his program. He finished his master's of project management, and recently just passed the God, what was it? I can't even think now. He recently just got PMA cert. So really super good news.
Wonderful. Congratulations. That's very exciting. Thank you. Yay. Anything else? Last call. Hearing none, I will remind you that we will go ahead and send the slides out as soon as I hit like end on this to everybody that registered. So you'll have that. The recording will be up tomorrow for folks, so please feel free to grab that. Thank you so much for joining us. Next week, we're talking about storytelling. How do we talk about all this stuff, and how can we use storytelling as a way to make sense of everything going on? And yes, until then, wash your hands, be safe,